In the first half of the 19th century, a profound religious revival swept across the United States, reshaping its spiritual landscape and leaving an indelible mark on the nation's social fabric. Known as the Second Great Awakening, this wave of religious fervor was more than just a movement of personal renewal. It was a cultural upheaval that challenged traditional ideas of predestination, empowered marginalized groups, and inspired social reform. The Second Great Awakening transformed not only the way Americans understood their faith, but also how they perceived their responsibilities to each other and to society as a whole. This is the story of the Second Great Awakening, a story of passionate preachers, emotional camp meetings, theological shifts, and a populace searching for a higher purpose in a rapidly changing world. And it is a story of how one generation's spiritual awakening sowed the seeds for sweeping social changes that would echo through the decades. The early 19th century was a time of tremendous change for the United States. The nation was still young, having declared independence from Britain less than 50 years earlier, and the foundational principles of freedom and democracy were still being forged. Yet beneath the optimism, America faced challenges that threatened to divide its people. Rapid westward expansion brought settlers into new territories, creating a patchwork of frontier communities with diverse beliefs and practices. This spread of population across rural regions often left isolated communities without formal churches, causing many to drift away from organized religion. At the same time, intellectual movements like the Enlightenment were encouraging people to question traditional authorities, including religious institutions. Enlightenment ideas emphasized reason, science, and humanism, which left some Americans feeling distant from the rigid doctrines and hierarchical structure of established churches. The combination of these factors, geographic dispersion, societal upheaval, and philosophical shifts, created fertile ground for a new wave of religious revivalism to take root. In response to this shifting landscape, a number of charismatic preachers emerged, eager to reconnect the people with their faith. They rejected the cold, intellectual sermons typical of earlier eras and instead embraced a passionate, emotional style of preaching that spoke directly to people's hearts. This was the dawn of the Second Great Awakening, a movement that emphasized individual conversion, the possibility of redemption for all, and the importance of a personal relationship with God. As the revival spread, a new phenomenon began to emerge across the countryside: the camp meeting. In the early 1800s, ministers would travel from town to town, gathering people for open-air services that lasted for days. These meetings became iconic symbols of the Second Great Awakening, and they brought together communities in ways that were unprecedented. People of all ages and backgrounds would travel from miles around, often camping on the site, to experience days of preaching, singing, and fellowship. The Cane Ridge Revival of 1801, held in a small settlement in Kentucky, is perhaps the most famous of these gatherings. Over a period of several days, an estimated 20,000 people converged on the rolling hills of Cane Ridge, a staggering number given the sparse population of the frontier. Ministers from multiple denominations, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, took turns preaching from stumps, wagons, and makeshift platforms, often shouting to be heard over the crowd. Witnesses described scenes of people falling out in trances, overcome by emotion and collapsing to the ground, while others broke into spontaneous prayer or song. The air was thick with fervor, as if the entire hillside had been set alight with spiritual passion. Camp meetings like Cane Ridge served a unique function in the rural frontier. They provided a rare opportunity for isolated communities to gather, reinforcing social bonds and a sense of shared identity. More importantly, they democratized religious experience. In these gatherings, the boundaries of class, race, and gender blurred as people came together as equals before God. White settlers, black slaves, free African Americans, men, women, and children all stood side by side, united in their desire for spiritual renewal. This openness was a radical departure from the often stratified structure of traditional churches, and it fostered a sense of inclusivity and collective empowerment. One of the defining characteristics of the Second Great Awakening was its break from Calvinist doctrines of predestination, which had dominated American Protestantism. According to Calvinism, God had already determined who would be saved and who would be damned, a concept that offered little hope for those who struggled with sin or felt unworthy of salvation. But the revivalists of the Second Great Awakening offered a different message. Preachers like Charles Grandison Finney, often regarded as the father of modern revivalism, argued that salvation was available to all who sincerely sought it. Finney's sermons emphasized free will and personal responsibility, asserting that each individual had the power to choose their path and pursue a relationship with God. He preached that anyone could achieve a state of grace through sincere repentance and moral living, a message that resonated deeply with people across the socio-economic spectrum. Finney's message suggested that God's love was accessible, not just to the privileged few, but to all who turned to him in faith. Finney was a revolutionary in both his theology and his methods. He rejected traditional sermon styles, opting instead for impassioned and often theatrical presentations that called listeners to immediate action. His Anxious Bench, a place where individuals struggling with conversion could sit at the front of the congregation, was a radical innovation at the time. This approach created a heightened sense of urgency and public accountability, encouraging people to confront their spiritual state openly. This shift from predestination to a more inclusive theology of free will had far-reaching effects. It empowered individuals, especially those in marginalized communities, to see themselves as worthy of divine love and capable of influencing their own salvation. This sense of personal empowerment, coupled with a duty to live a righteous life,